Hello everyone, this is Chris Jamel at Exiton Interactive, and by the time that we're done with this video, we will have made it so that we are not allowed to send any request into the server if the form is invalid. So we see that the send button is disabled. Once we input valid information into all of the inputs, it will then allow us to send it in. You'll also note that as far as when we're logging in, we will not require the confirm password email or confirm email inputs to have any information before we're sending them in. Once a request is sent in, it will display that, hey, there's an error with the different controls, in this case the password and the username. We'll also show that the inputs are invalid through the color and the indicator, the icon. We will also say that if a user is to adjust the input to make it valid and would go back to the previous input, it will show that that is invalid without having to send in another request to the server to check to see if it's valid again. So with those mentioned, I do want to remind you that you can find a link to the article for this video in the description below, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, let's begin here with just reminding us where we are from the last video. So if we don't actually need to input anything, but if we send a request to the server to log in, we're having the server is returning to us some model state errors for our controls. So that's where we left off from the previous video, and now we need to use these and sort of display this information to the user so that the user can make the corrective action. So let's go back to Visual Studio here. And the first thing I'm going to modify is the authenticator.component.ts file. So let me go to that. And so we have the model state errors that are contained within our HTTP service. What we're going to want to do is to modify those errors for display purposes. We want to put them in a form that's better for displaying. And to do that, then I'm going to create a private field here. So we'll come down here. We'll create a private, call it model errors. Model errors is going to be an object, and we'll start off with it being an empty object. We'll define it a little bit. As usual, it's going to have a key, or it's going to have a string indexer, and that thing is going to return as a property. It's going to be an object. That object then will have a property on it called errors. The errors will be a string array. All right, so this will make a little more sense once we can visually see it. But let's go down now to the login method. And that's where we were doing this console log statement. Let's go ahead and remove that. And what I'm going to do is call a new method called this.xhr failure. So there's going to be several times that we perform a request to the server, whether logging in, registering, forgot username, forgot password. All of those can respond to us saying that there was some error. So let's create this new method at the bottom here. So it's a private, I called it XHR failure. Perfect. So what we're going to do for this is, actually I forgot that I need to import the each function from Lodash. So let me do that while I'm thinking about it. Import, I'll call it Lodash each equals require Lodash/each. Now we'll go back down to the method we just created. And then I'm going to scroll down and we'll say this dot model errors. We'll go ahead and set that back to an empty object. And we'll see shortly when I modify, we're going to display this information on the template. So we're going to have to modify our pug file. That's the reason why I started with it being an empty object to begin with, so that we don't have any errors in when Angular creates everything. But when we come down here to the failure, we're just going to set the model errors to an empty object again. And inside of here, we're going to say hello dash each. We're going to iterate over this dot authenticator HTTP service dot model state errors. We'll pass those in. Whoops. Okay. I hate it when it formats it like that. All right. So now what we're going to do is say const and control key. That's going to be equal to, put on our backticks there. It's going to be control. If we look at, actually I should have mentioned it. So if we look, right, we're being passed in the key. To convert the key that's being passed to us to a control key, all we have to do is tack on key or control on the front of the error key that's being passed into us. So now all we have to do is say this underscore model errors, and we're going to set the control key. That's going to be equal to an object. That object again has an errors property, and that's just going to be the value of the error that's the model state error. All right, so now to make sure that that worked correctly, let's go ahead and make our console log down here, and this will just console log the model errors. Save that. Go back. We'll just, I don't know why I keep typing in something that's not required, but let's just hit send. So we've gotten back our response, and now we've converted the information that was sent from the server to, you know, a form that we like better for displaying in the user interface. All right, let's go back to Visual Studio, and I guess we're ready to start displaying it. So let's go to the authenticator.component.pug file, so the template. What we're going to do is go down to our info mixin, and we're going to modify this. So we have the heading here. I'm going to put the errors just below it. So we're going to create an unordered list. We're going to give it a model-errors class for styling. Put in our parentheses. We'll do our ngIf that we've seen a few times now with our backticks. And then we're going to create this property on our class here in a minute. But it'll just be a property called model errors. And we'll pass in, or we'll check for whether or not the index from using the key comes back to being undefined. So what we'll do is pass in we'll put our pair of single quotes, do our string interpolation for the key. So if this object does not exist on our model errors object, then the ngIf will be false. But if it's there, it'll be true, and then we'll want to display our LIs inside there. This is the first time we've seen the ng4. So ng4 equals, put our backticks. We'll say let error of model errors, and we'll do the same indexing here. But if we look, so we're looking at this object here. It has, so when we pass in the control name, we'll get back this object, and it has a property of errors. So we need to say at the end here, dot errors. So that's our array of strings. We'll put our pair of curly braces on the outside, and we'll display the error. Oops. So let me go ahead and save that. First off, let's go in and create, because I think we should be getting an error. Yes. Let's go inside to the authenticator.component.ts file and create the getter for the model errors. We'll come up here. We'll create a public getter. I guess I should try and keep it in order. Public get model errors. We'll return this dot underscore model errors. Save that. Back to the browser. Error's gone. Type something in there. Send. Got our error back. And it's hard to see it, but these these 3 lines that are jumbled up or kind of scrunched into here, or 4 lines, I guess, into here, those are the model errors. So let's go ahead and style them to make them easier to read. Go into the authenticator.component.scss file. Do our usual authenticator, and I think we called them .model errors. And actually I'm just going to copy this stuff in. So what I'm doing is basically putting in a border around that unordered list. I don't want there to be a border on the left and right, so we'll make the width to be 0. The colors for all of the LIs will be the invalid color. We'll give the padding here, and then why I separated them out, padding left. Could have put it together, but we'll keep it. And then we'll have background color will be a little bit darker, and then we want disks for the list style. Let me save that. Back to the browser. Run it again. Get our negative response, and now we can see that this how we've styled the model errors. All right. So let's see. Let's change one thing, I think. So in the last video, I also showed how to add this error for creating, or when the model binder in the ASP.NET binds the object, it creates this message for us. I don't like it, doesn't fit in with anything else. If this thing is less than the min length, it should return just saying minimum length is. So let's go back and change that real quick. Let me close the style sheet. So that again is back in our models folder. We have this account login request, and it's this big long thing that's responsible. Let me just delete that for the moment and copy these in. So all we have here is just separated into 2 attributes, one for max length, one for min length, and then we have the error messages. We'll save that, rebuild, go back. Since we rebuilt, we have to refresh. We're going to close that login model since we don't need it anymore. I'm going to buy time here and scroll my notes down, and let's go back to the browser. Now we'll send something in, send, get our 400, and now we have the min length is 8. So that's a little bit better, more in keeping with the rest of them. So now let's return back to Visual Studio. We need to modify our template again, so the authenticator.component.pug file. And if you remember, when we create our info pages, for most of them we're sending in the control password key, and the welcome one we're just sending in this string default. It's good enough at the time, but let's just sort of unify our approach here. So we're going to pass in a variable called control default key. And so what we need to do is to come back up here and define what that is. So we'll add this to our variables. So control default key, and that'll just be control default. Save the template. I think that's all we need for the template for now. We'll just leave it for a second. And now we'll have to go back into our authenticator.component.ts file. And actually, I think I forgot to mention why I'm doing this. But, you know, if we get a response back from the server, let me go ahead and let's fix this real quick so it'll stop giving us an error. But what's happening here is that we'll get the errors back, and the only reason that I would know that there's an error there is if I cycle through all of the inputs, which is, of course, not the user experience that we're looking for. We should know that there is an error if, you know, from the default info screen, and that's what we're setting out to fix now. So at the moment, we need to modify a few things here. We have this default info ID. Now we want to call this control default info ID. And we're going to move it up to be with its friends up here. We also need to create a key. So that's public get control, what I call a default key. That's return control default. When I change that control default info, or changed it to that control info or default info ID, we generated an error. This error is down here in the ng after view init method. And that's there because this is the point at which we're getting the DOM elements for the default page. And this should now be control default info ID. All right, so with that done, let's go down to the XHR failure method. So this is where we're populating all of our errors. We are going to get rid of this console log while we're at it. What I'm going to do here is, after we've created the empty model errors object, I'm going to say this dot underscore model errors, and we're going to create the object on it. So this dot control default key equals an object. I'll put that parentheses here in a second. It's going to have an errors, of course, errors property, and it's going to be an empty array. Now what we want to do is to come down here in the low-each method, and then we'll say this underscore model errors, and we're going to modify the control default key, its errors property. We'll just push in for now the key coming in from the error. So let's go ahead and save that. Turn to the browser, and we'll do this again. We'll send in a request. So now on the default screen, we have it printing out telling us, hey, there's a problem with the password and there's a problem with the username. So you can go to those and then see it. All right. That takes care of that part for us. All right, so next thing that we're going to do is to tell our form basically that there is such a thing as a model error, and there would be, we need to know that to say whether this form is valid. So if we picked, something valid, sent that in, it's valid in the sense that it has the, right number of characters. If I click on the username, right, we don't have the required minimum length, but it's still coming back and telling us that there's some errors. But right now our form has no idea about a model error. So let's deal with that. First thing that we're going to do to tell that there's a model error is to modify the pug file again. So we're in the template. We're going to modify the buttons mixin, wherever it's at. Yep, right here. The reason why we're going to modify the button is that I want to be able to disable the button, the send button, if the form is invalid. So we're going to bind to the disabled property. So we'll put in our square brackets, say disabled, equals, and our backticks. And the way we're going to do this is call a function is button disabled. Put on our parentheses and our pair of single quotes, dollar curly braces key. Save that. Go into the component, the authenticator.component.ts file. And actually I'm jumping the gun just a little bit. I want to modify one more thing. So there's many times here in the past where I've written something like type of property not equal to undefined and property not equal to null. I'm tired of writing that. I would not be writing it normally, but it was a misguided attempt, I think, to not bring in any more functions than I needed. Now I've decided that I need it. So I'm going to go to the vendor.ts file, and we're going to import another function from Lodash. So import Lodash / is nil. Save that. Let's go back to, actually we can close the vendor.ts file and go back to the authenticator.component.ts file. Of course, the reason that I wanted that is to use it here in this file. So let's go back up to the top and import it into this file. Save it. I think we're probably in a inconsistent state. At least we need to completely refresh everything because of the change to the vendor.ts. I'm just going to rebuild the project, go back to the browser and hit refresh. So that'll be at least up to date. All right. So one thing that we want is that if the user enters, say, a username that's valid as far as the number of characters, it contains the right characters, if they send that in and the server responds back to say that that username is invalid for whatever reason, then when the user changes their input, we want to remember what the old username was. So if they change it back to the old username, we want to still show that it's invalid without having to send the request back to the server. So we're going to have to remember what information was sent to the server. So I'm going to create another private field here. We'll scroll down here. We'll call it private, and I've just called it XHR data. We'll give it a type of any. Set it to null to begin with. And first things first, what we're going to do is to go down. We're going to create that isButton disabled method. Let's create that. HI, where are we at? Here we are. So I called it public isButton disabled. I'm going to pass in the key, which is a string. We're going to switch on that key. The default state is going to be return false. So the button is not disabled. For the moment, all we care about is the button send key. And we're going to return just this, the auth form dot invalid. So if the form is invalid, we're going to return true, which means the button is disabled. All right. So I'm going to save that. I think I should at least let everything run without having an error. And we do in fact see that the send button is grayed out because it's disabled. Return back to Visual Studio, and we're going to go down to the create form group method, maybe. So we're going to create what I call a server error for basically all of our controls. I think all of them except for remember me. So in order to make this easier, we're just going to create a helper function in here. I'll call it const get server error validator. Okay. What we're going to pass into this thing is the key. I'll call it control key here. And then we're also going to pass in the XHR data key, which is also a string. All right, so now what we want to do is return an object from here. So we'll return object. That object consists of a validator, and that's in the our validator's namespace, and this is the one we're going to use called user defined. And that one requires us to pass in a config object. The config contains an error property, which is just the name of the error, server error. Then we'll come down here and we'll say we also have to pass in a pass function. So a function telling it whether or not the control passed this validator. So what we'll say here, let me just copy them in. All I'm saying is that if model errors is undefined or null, return true, or if the model errors does not contain an entry for the specified control key, return true. I'm also saying returning true, it passes if there is no XHR data or the XHR data does not contain a key, a property with that key index or string indexer. Finally, what we'll do is we'll have just a return statement here. So we'll look at the control by the control key, and we'll look at its value, and we'll look to see that its value is not equal to what was already sent to the server, which came back to be invalid, right? So this is just basically us checking the cache on what was sent previously. So now we have to apply this server error to all of our, or almost all of our validators. So let's come in here and go into the compose here. So what we're doing here is making use of, actually I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just add the validator. So again, we're doing the server error using the function we just created, passing in the email's control key, or the control email key, and the data is going to be email. So when we send it to the server, the key for that entry is going to be just email. Okay. We need to do the same thing here for the password. We'll do the confirm ones at the end. Again, control password key. Password will be the name of it when we send it in to the server. Modify the username. All right, and now we need to deal with the confirm information. So let's see. Here's the confirm email. Right, and last one, confirm password. All right, so we've applied those validators. Let's go down to the login method. Instead of just passing this information in, we have to remember what it was. So this dot XHR data is equal to that stuff there. So now we'll just pass in the this dot XHR data, and we'll save that. All right, so let's go back to the browser. Now remember, we have the send button being disabled. Let's put in information that's valid. Perfect. Copy. And we see form is now valid. Send button is available to us. Send that in. We're getting back our errors. Presumably they are being applied to the controls. We don't know it yet. Of course, we need to fix a couple things, right? First of all, for login, all we need is username and password. We don't care about the other controls here, the confirm emails. And the controls aren't showing that this is in fact invalid. We have server errors on them. Let's go back to Visual Studio and take care of both of those. So let's see, let's go back to the form control group, or create form control group. Where was that? Create form group. All right, so let's modify this thing here. So this is what I was going to refer to earlier, just too early, is when we first created the compose method in our validator's namespace, we created the ability to specify a skip function. So the skip function, if it's defined, if that returns true, then validation for that control is just skipped. Okay, so let's see, for example, what we're talking about here. So let's do email. So we're passing this into the compose. Let's format a little bit. So what we're saying here for the email control, we're going to skip it if the user is logging in and we're not using one of the sub actions, right? Because if the user has forgotten their password or forgotten their username, we're going to need to know the email to send them, the email to recover their password and so forth. So if we're registering, then it's required. But if we're logging in and not using any of the sub actions, then the email is not required. Next, we will do password. Yep. So let's do password. We need it here. Format things a little bit. So we're saying is that if we're logging in and it's one of the sub actions, we need to skip the password, right? We don't need the password if the user has forgotten their password. So now we'll come down and deal with username. And for the username, we're saying if it's one of the sub actions, then we're not going to require the username. I sort of started off with if the user had forgotten their password, we'll require them to put in their username and their email. but I think that's probably redundant anyway, because, you know, probably I'm going to get back a, you know, don't remember, you know, I think it's redundant to have require the username. So we're just going to say if it's a sub action, all we need is the email input. And now we'll do the confirms. They're easy. So if we go to the confirms, compose, all we're saying here is that if the user is attempting to log in, then we aren't needing to confirm anything. Oops. For either the password or the email. We'll save that. And while we're at it real quick, let's go down to the XHR failure method. Last thing that we want to do in here is to say this.formController.update values and validities. So once we get those model errors back, we have to tell our controller to update everything. Now we'll return to the browser and we're ready to go. Let's in fact put in well, I guess we have to validate it now, but so let's put in valid. And you can see all we have is the username and password input. We haven't done the other three, and we have the send button. Let's press send. We'll get our error response back, and now we have it transition to telling us that these are invalid. If I add another letter to it, it says, hey, that's great. Go ahead and send that in if you correct the password. But now if I remove that one letter, it still tells me that that username is invalid without having to communicate with the server again. Let's go back to Visual Studio. Actually, I think looking at the notes, that will actually wrap it up for this video. All right. I think I'm not quite sure what we're going to do in the next one. I'm leaning towards dealing with starting to animate the controls. Seems like one of the big things left to do here, but I guess we'll have to wait and see until then. Thank you for taking the time to watch our video. I know that your time is valuable. If you liked the video, please subscribe to our channel and click the thumbs up button, as well as share the video with your friends. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave them in the comments section below. And once again, thank you, and I will talk to you in the next video.